Clive, thanks very much. Yes, a very good evening from Edinburgh, where the SNP unveiled its manifesto today, pledging an end to austerity with an increase in spending on public services and the NHS. Nicola Sturgeon said she wanted to make the voice of Scotland heard more loudly at Westminster and offered what she called a hand of friendship to people across the UK. She also tried to allay fears about the SNP's likely influence after May the 7th in the event of a hung parliament, but once again the campaign has been marked by questions about the price that the SNP would demand in exchange for support. First tonight, a report on the SNP's manifesto launch by our Scotland correspondent James Cook.
For nearly a century, the Scottish National Party stood on the sidelines of British politics. Not anymore. Nicola Sturgeon heads into this general election on a high. In 2010, her party won just 6 seats. They've never had more than 11. But this time, polls suggest they're on track for 50 or even more. No wonder it was a rock star welcome in this rock climbing arena.
This is a manifesto to make Scotland stronger at Westminster.
You'd expect her to say that, of course, but today's event was also aimed at a wider audience.
So to everyone who, like me, wants this election to herald the real and positive change that will make life better for ordinary people across these islands, I hold out a hand of friendship.
And so, if neither Labour nor the Conservatives win a majority and the SNP hold the balance of power, what might change?
It is a manifesto above all else to end austerity. That will be our #1 priority. That is why we are putting forward today a clear alternative to the further spending cuts proposed by both Labour and the Tories. We want to see modest spending increases by the equivalent of increasing departmental spending by 0.5% above inflation in each year of the next Parliament.
But hang on a minute. Is this the Scottish National Party settling for a better Britain?
The SNP will always support independence. But this election is not about independence. It is about making Scotland stronger.
Nicola Sturgeon is not so much scaling the heights as walking a tightrope. Her supporters still want independence as soon as possible, but this manifesto argues for positive change within the UK. It is a tricky balancing act. Ms Sturgeon is promising a higher minimum wage, an extra £9.5 billion for the NHS and the reversal of some welfare cuts. So how would she pay for it?
The price of my plan is that it would take a couple of years, maybe 3 years longer, to completely eliminate the deficit. It's the sensible, fiscally responsible way forward. It's not saying debt and deficit isn't important.
Well, you better hope you can grow the economy as fast as you think you can.
It's about how you get yourself out of deficit. You can do it the way the Tories have tried to do it, with savagely cutting, and we all see the impact of that, or we do it in a more humane way. The one that says economic policy is not an end in itself, it's a means to allow people to live better, healthier, happier, more prosperous lives.
The SNP leader is also promising not to replace Britain's nuclear weapons and to support higher taxes on the rich. When the United Kingdom votes 2 weeks on Thursday, this Scottish nationalist could take centre stage. James Cook, BBC News, Edinburgh.
So, as we've heard, Nicola Sturgeon announced her wish for higher public spending, which she said could lead to an extra £140 billion of new investment, including more money for the NHS. Her opponents say it's a recipe for more debt and financial chaos. The SNP is now asking for the Scottish Government to be given full financial responsibility. That's the phrase being used. Our economics editor, Robert Peston, has been looking at some of the numbers in the SNP manifesto.
The route to Scottish prosperity? The £1.5 billion new Queensferry crossing spanning the Firth of Forth. And today the SNP said it wanted to see greater investment and public expenditure throughout the UK. So what would it mean for the UK's public finances if the SNP were to get its way and spending on public services were to rise by 0.5% a year? Well, that could lead to an increase in the national debt or in taxes of at least £140 billion by 2020, more than health spending throughout the UK. Now, the national debt is already expected by the current government to be a record £1.63 trillion in 5 years. But under SNP plans, it could instead be nearer £1.8 trillion. Even so, debt as a share of national income would be falling by then, though not by much and years later than under Tory plans.
The SNP plans for spending imply quite a significantly higher level of spending compared to the current coalition government plans and compared to the proposals of the Conservative Party. They're actually somewhat similar, I would think, to what Labour are proposing. Labour are also planning to spend potentially quite a bit more than the Conservatives have said they would be willing to spend in the next Parliament, and probably in a very similar ballpark to what the SNP are talking about.
Nicola Sturgeon says she'll force a UK government to be more progressive and spend more on public services. So what's the record of the SNP in Scotland in government? Well, health spending per head rose 8.1% in Scotland between 2008 and 2013, less, as it happens, than an 11.7% rise in England. And spending on Scottish schools per head fell nearly 4% over this period, compared with a rise of 6% in England. But although austerity in health and schools appears to have bitten deeper in Scotland than England, it's very important to remember that public spending per head is much higher in Scotland than in England, 18% higher in 2014 at £10,275. Bridge building here in Scotland, and Nicola Sturgeon says between her party and so-called progressives throughout the UK. And there's the paradox. The party that wants independence for Scotland trying to persuade Labour as a potential Westminster government to cut less and borrow more, not just for Scotland, but for the whole of the UK. Robert Peston, BBC News.
Well, the SNP's opponents have been busy questioning the assumptions behind the party's spending plans. So here's some of the day's political reaction for you, starting with David Cameron for the Conservatives.
Labour and the SNP get into power, you're going to see an alliance between a party that wants to spend, borrow and tax more with another party that wants to spend, borrow and tax even more. It might be a match made in heaven for them, but it is a match made in hell for the British economy.
I think the most significant thing about the SNP manifesto today is the fact that they haven't ruled out a second referendum in the next 5 years, having said that it was a once-in-a-generation, once-in-a-lifetime decision. I think that's the wrong priority for the people of Scotland and the people of the United Kingdom.
The SNP have published a manifesto today, which is a short-term manifesto built on long-term debt. They claim it's progressive. There is nothing remotely progressive or fair in simply racking up debt and asking our children, our grandchildren to pay off the price of this generation's mistakes.
To anyone that is worried about the Scottish tail wagging the English and British dog is to vote UKIP, because we're the only ones that will rebalance the system, and we're the only ones that will break this political consensus that means taxpayers' money all goes to Scotland.
Some of the day's reaction there to the SNP manifesto. Our political editor, Nick Robinson, whose voice is getting a little better after that recent surgery, has been taking his own look at the SNP manifesto, and these are Nick's thoughts.
Something truly extraordinary happened today. A woman who's not even running as a candidate in this election, whose party is standing in just one of the 4 nations of the UK, which, even if it does as spectacularly well as some opinion polls suggest, would have just 1 in 13 MPs in Westminster, has come to dominate this election. Nicola Sturgeon, the undoubted star of the campaign so far, pledged to build not just a stronger Scotland, but a better and more progressive politics for everyone. Her headline pledge was that SNP MPs would back a bigger increase in NHS spending throughout the UK than any other party has so far promised. Now that's pretty interesting, because the Independent Institute of Fiscal Studies says that in the past few years, when, remember, the SNP has been running the health service in Scotland, it hasn't increased spending on the NHS anything like as fast as the Tory-led coalition in Westminster. even though spending in Scotland is still higher. The Conservatives are mighty keen to talk up the dangers of the SNP backing a Labour government that hasn't got a clear parliamentary majority. But tonight a former Conservative Scottish Secretary, Lord Forsyth, told The Guardian that the Prime Minister and his party were playing a dangerous game and could even threaten the integrity of the country long term.
Well, then let's have some more on today's events here in Edinburgh. The SNP's manifesto launch, and one of the features of today's event was the way that Nicola Sturgeon repeatedly denied that she was out to damage Westminster. She was extending the hand of friendship, she said, and she dismissed suggestions that voters in England needed to feel threatened or scared by her or by the SNP. Our correspondent John Kay has been to test some English views in Cumbria, in the border city of Carlisle.
You can just about see Scotland from the centre of Carlisle, and on the high street the influence is clear. So how about MPs from the Scottish National Party having more say over things here? How much do you trust the SNP to deliver for the whole of the UK?
I don't. No, I don't. I just don't.
I just don't agree with them coming down here, sort of taking over.
Everyone we spoke to knew the name of the SNP leader, but they were divided over how much power she should have.
She's a very astute woman. She seems to know what she's talking about. But whether it will be for the good of this country, I just wonder. I think it won't.
I think she's very good. I think she should definitely stand up for women and a lot more women things than what they currently do.
All my own burgers.
Butcher Chris is an English voter, but he thinks the SNP could stick up for people like him.
They seem to have a lot of good points. They might do us all a favour by helping us out.
And in the park, beneath St George, we found more English SNP fans.
It'll be good to have a good Scottish presence in England because they've done a lot for Scotland. You know, they've brought jobs to Scotland and they want to end austerity. I think that's what we should do in England.
Although we've met people here who welcome the influence of the SNP and others who worry about it, we haven't met a single person who says it will affect the way they vote.
But this is one city close to the Scottish border. Will voters feel differently elsewhere? John Kay, BBC News, Carlisle.
John there taking the temperature in Carlisle. Back here in Edinburgh, Brian Taylor's with me, our Scotland political editor. This talk of extending the hand of friendship, Brian, what do we make of that?
I think it's a sincere offer, but it's also, of course, strategic. The SNP calculation is that people generally, including voters here in Scotland, prefer an offer of cooperation to one of confrontation. It's also in keeping with the SNP's approach at Holyrood, which has been to seek to govern consensually within the limits of devolved power, thus inviting voters to infer that perhaps there's nothing all that fearful and frightening about independence itself.
And as we look the remaining few weeks of this campaign, how do you think today's launch is going to impact on that?
I think it's intriguing. I think it works on a number of levels. First of all, it presents a challenge to Labour. In as much as they agree with Labour, they are therefore highlighting the points where they don't agree. So the SNP are saying, for example, that they would not upgrade the Trident deterrent, they would use the money on nurses and schools, and they invite voters to ask the Labour Party if they would do the same. With regard to the Conservatives, the SNP are challenging the Prime Minister's verdict that it would be frightening for a party that opposes the Union to be involved in the governance of the UK. They say what was meant when it was said to the people of Scotland that they should lead the UK, not leave it. You also have some on the Union side, other members of from other parties who support the Union, questioning the Tory judgment, saying that it could inflame the people of England, inflame them in a way that causes polarisation and division for an SNP party seeking independence. What's not to like?
Intriguing, Brian. Again, thanks very much. We'll talk soon.
Labour has ruled out any kind of post-UK election deal with the SNP. Scottish Labour leader Jim Murphy said his party was aiming for a majority win, but SNP leader Nicola Sturgeon said her opponents must face the reality of a possible hung parliament. Here's our political correspondent, Andrew Black.
Jim Murphy says it's time to cut through the SNP spin. The Labour politician says the election is a fight between his party and the Conservatives, and today firmly set out his views on working with the Nationalists.
There'll be no deal, no pact and no coalition with the SNP because we can't surely spend the next few years debating a referendum again.
So, does that cause problems for Nicola Sturgeon's strategy to use an SNP balance of power to help Labour get into government in the event of a hung parliament?
You know, they might want to behave in the campaign as if they're still trying to win a majority, that's fair enough. But if at the end of the day they don't win a majority, they're going to have to reflect that reality.
But the Scottish Conservative leader isn't having any of it. As Ruth Davidson ruled out any future deal between her own party and the SNP, she said it's clear what's really going on.
Well, I've been saying since January, if you go back and check, I was saying in January that Ed Miliband and Nicola Sturgeon are halfway down the aisle to a deal. What's this going to mean? Is there going to be a second referendum? And people in Scotland are genuinely worried about this.
But Willie Rennie of the Scottish Liberal Democrats said Tory warnings about the SNP posing risks to the UK had taken a sinister turn.
It's despicable what the Conservatives are doing in this campaign. I think the way that they are trying to use Alex Salmond and the SNP to represent Scotland, this is critically important, Gordon, to demonise Scotland, is what they are doing is festering English nationalism.
And could it be even more complicated? Smaller parties like UKIP reckon disillusionment with the bigger ones could work to their advantage.
People make up their own mind. They either want to live in an authoritarian SNP state or they want to live in a British libertarian state. That's what I want.
The main UK parties in this election say they're fighting for every last vote to secure a majority, but the SNP suggesting that what they might be thinking in private is something completely different. Andrew Black, reporting Scotland.